Hi, welcome back to another video. If you don't know me, I'm Helen from Crafty So and So, and I have this YouTube channel and a blog. So on this channel I like to create really helpful sewing tips and videos to help beginners get going into the wonderful world of sewing. I also make sew along videos along with tutorials to help people work out where they might be going wrong, or just to sew along with me for fun. So my sewing journey started when I was younger, and I was more into designing than I was sewing until I got to college and started doing a bit more sewing there. And then I decided to go to university to do a performance and historical costume degree. From there, I've just enjoyed sewing, from doing everything from costume to create my own clothes, to following sewing patterns, to making my own kind of home decors and things like that. All these different things, I really enjoy the process of sewing, and so I wanted to document more of it on this channel. My main reason for creating this video was because my sewing journey hasn't always been smooth. I've not been somebody who had the natural knack of sewing and just was able to sit on a sewing machine and go and create something wonderful. I was quite the opposite. I think I found quite a lot of friction and jarring, and it was something that took me quite a lot of time to learn. Something I'm still learning today. There's still a lot that I don't know. So I kind of had a think about the things that really stuck out to me when I first started sewing, which was my first year at university, was where I really took sewing seriously, mainly because I had to, but also because I wanted to. And that year I learned a lot about what I was doing wrong, what I didn't know was wrong, and kind of what is like the small details that really do matter that you don't think would. So I decided to create this video to help other people that were me in that situation know more about what they should be doing, what they shouldn't be doing, and ways to improve, basically. So before we get started, if you enjoy this video, please give it a like, subscribe to my channel, and turn on the notification bell so you can be alerted every time I upload a video. I also wanted to make you aware that I am doing a real beginner's sewing journey right now. So I'm doing everything from being able to use your sewing machine to starting your first project, and those videos will be going live within the next few weeks. So let's get into the 8 things I wish I knew as a beginner sewer. Number 1 is fabric choice is crucial. So what a lot of beginners will do, will get really excited about a project, and they'll be like, I'm going to go fabric shopping and I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, and a lot of the time they'll buy a fabric that's completely not usable or compatible for a beginner. They'll buy something like a silk or a satin or even a velvet, and all these fabrics can be quite hard to work with because they're slippery, they kind of pull out of place, they're very hard to work with because of how loose the structure is of the actual weave and the actual fabric. So they can be very hard to kind of pin down and work with, and they're not very good for if you are still new to, using your fingers in such an intricate way or being able to pin things a certain way. And if you're still really new to sewing, you really want to start with fabrics that are really easy and really simple to work with. Fabrics such as cottons are like the basic fabric that I recommend every beginner start sewing with, something cotton. And the best thing about cotton is that you can use it for a number of things, from clothing to home decor to things for your kids to your baby's nursery. There's a lot of things that cotton can be made into, so you don't have to be kind of pigeonholed into one area of sewing for that. You can really expand through different areas to be able to build your knowledge and your confidence in the sewing sector. Cottons are a really standard fabric that don't tend to stretch too much, they don't kind of fray too much, they don't do anything that might jeopardize a project for a beginner that's still kind of getting to know all the ins and outs of things. So try a few different projects with cotton first. Don't jump ahead and think that you can go into, the silks and the satins and the crepes and the everything else. These you really want to start off with a basic fabric, build up your confidence, and then go into more complicated fabrics later on. Number 2 is play around with the fabric first. So as a beginner, you're very likely to be unaware of every single fabric there is to know. I definitely am not a beginner, and I still don't know every single fabric that's out there. And so you really want to take the time to be able to understand the fabric that you're working with, feel it, touch it, stretch it, kind of work it out, iron it, do all these different things, fold it, pleat it. All these different things you want to kind of like get really handsy with the fabric, so then you can understand how it works, how it lays, how it drapes, and the best kind of techniques and kind of settings that you need for your sewing machine and iron for that fabric. Also, don't be afraid to do some research, whether that's asking a friend, asking in a group, or asking the fabric store themselves, or even just doing a little online research about the fabric and best ways to use it. If, like me, you often forget things, like I often forget what fabric I've used, what it was called, and I like to sew. I like to keep a little book, just an A5 book. I like to keep a fabric swatch of the fabric I've used, the name of it, the kind of makeup of it, the print, and where it was bought and things like that. I like to keep a little log, because then I like to be able to touch the fabric and feel it and kind of pull it and kind of work out if it was going to be right for the project that I'm wanting it to be for, or if I want to be able to buy some more for a certain project I'm looking to do. This is a great way of you like building up your knowledge of fabrics and being able to kind of create like a little database for yourself. It's really good because of reference. You'll be able to reference back and be like, oh, that dress is this, and that's how I need to treat it and wash it and things like that. It's really handy to have that on hand. Number 3 is read your sewing pattern and get all your materials out first. So I can be a little bit what people call gung-ho, or I like to jump the gun when it comes to certain things, and sewing's definitely one of those things. I think because I think I know everything. I don't think I know everything, but I think I know enough to be able to like skip that step, and I don't need to do that bit. So I jump ahead and I just do what I think is right, and then at the end I'll get to it and think, well, why is that like that? And why is this like this? And what do I need to do with this piece? And so I often kind of just skip ahead of things and don't pay attention, or I get started and I've got something missing, like interfacing or elastic, or a different kind of thread, and all these things that you need to kind of stop and prepare first before you get started, because you'll get halfway through, realise you don't have it, you'll have to put it to a side until you get it, or you have to go out and then get it, and it's all these things that kind of ruin the sewing flow. So make sure you have everything to start before you get going, and then you've got a better chance of being able to just kind of have a nice flow with your sewing and have a better chance of making it and completing it within that time frame that you're working with. I've done this a lot, where I start a project and then I get to a point I'm like, I don't even have that, so I'll just put it to a side and I'll just buy it another day. I don't ever buy it another day, and it just sits there forever until I decide that I'm not going to complete that project because I've lost the passion for it, and it goes to recycling, or I go make it into something else, or these things really do happen, and they will happen. There'll be something that you just jar with that you can't quite get over, and you'll probably just put it to a side, keep coming back to it, and you might never finish it, or you might just do a bit at a time. These things happen, and it doesn't have to be the end of the world. But if you want to prevent a lot of that happening, make sure you have everything you need for that project before you start it. There was a saying at school, fail to prepare, prepare to fail. That's kind of what this reminds me of. If you've got everything you possibly think you're going to need, if you're using a pattern like a garment, and for a coat, and you need interfacing and so much fabric, you need the matching colour thread, you need some buttons, and you need, a way to make buttonholes. If you've got all that ready to go, then you shouldn't have any reason why you stop or can't complete your project, unless it's midnight and you really need to go to sleep because you've got work in the morning, or the kids are home so you need to put the sewing machine away. Things like that will be the things that stop you, but otherwise, if you've got everything you can possibly get for this project, to give yourself a better chance of being able to get as far as you can, then that's how you need to proceed. Number 4 is get your sewing space set up, ready to go. Again, another way of being able to prepare everything for the best possible outcome for your sewing session is to prepare your sewing space. So this means all your tools and your pattern, everything materials wise, and your actual sewing space. So if you need to work on a table to cut out, or even the floor, make sure it's clear, make sure it's ready to go. Make sure you've got your iron and your ironing board set up. The iron doesn't necessarily have to be on, just make sure it's plugged in and ready to go. So then when you do need it, you can just flip the switch, let it heat up, and you can be using it. Your sewing machine is important that it is set up, it's on the right stitch settings, it's got the right foot attached, it has the right needle in. Obviously I'll go through another video of needles because that's a whole other ball game completely. And make sure you've got the right colour thread and that your bobbin is also in the same colour thread and it's full. All these things have to be kind of in place, ready for you, because then it's less friction, you don't have to stop and start. So say you're having a really good run, you've got your music on or something, or you know, an ebook on in the background, and you're enjoying your afternoon sewing and you've got all your pattern pieces cut out and you're ready to sew them together. You've not got your sewing machine set up, so you have to go get your sewing machine, you have to set it up, you have to check everything's ready to go and do your test stitches, and then you can sew. It kind of takes wind out of your sails. So if you do all this beforehand and make sure everything's kind of prepped and ready, then you've got a better chance of being able to just keep going and flow with the sewing afternoon. You just kind of can just keep going, and it's much more enjoyable, and it's getting rid of that friction, and you can just enjoy yourself. You're going to just be more confident, you're going to enjoy what you're doing, and once you enjoy what you're doing, you're going to be better at it, which is the most important thing. So on this topic of sewing spaces, this doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a sewing room. I don't have a sewing room. I have a little space in our back bedroom that I use. I also use the living room, which I'm in now, and sometimes I use the kitchen. It's completely what I'm working on, where I want to be. You know, like today, the sunshine is beautiful and it's kind of coming into the living room, so that's where I want to be. Sometimes I don't mind being in the back bedroom because that's a nice little cozy space. It kind of depends on what you have available, where you want to be in the house. Sometimes you might want to just be in the bedroom, just, you know, on the floor, work there with a little desk. Completely up to you where you want to work. You don't need a dedicated sewing room to make anything beautiful. You can do it in the corner of your living room and still have something beautiful at the end of it. Number 5 on the list is ironing matters. So as you might remember, I said I was a little lazy and a little bit unprepared for my first year at university. And ironing was one of these things. I totally didn't think that you needed to iron every single seam or press your fabric each time you'd, done something with it. I really just thought you could just iron it at the end and it'll all work out. Wrong. Very, very wrong. Make sure you iron in between your steps. Make sure you keep going back to the ironing board to press your seams. Make sure that you're just kind of making the most out of your fabric. Make sure you've washed your fabric before and ironed it, so then it's pre-shrunk. Some fabrics do pre-shrink, so make sure you've already done that before you make your garment, because then at least you know once you've washed your garment, it fits. Things like this, I didn't really pay attention to at all. I just kind of went with it, and that was that. I just was like, oh, it'll be fine. It'll work out in the end. Doesn't. Sorry, it just doesn't. I'm trying to prepare you now so you haven't made this beautiful dress for summer, put it in the washing machine, it comes out and it's 2 sizes too small. All these things you need to prepare for. So make sure you iron your seams in between or every time you've kind of done one. If you're like me, I like to sit and do all the seams first, then I'll take it to the ironing board and then I'll iron them. That's fine. Just make sure that you keep ironing your seams, ironing your fabric, and making sure that everything's kind of in play. The best part about taking your garment away from the sewing machine and kind of stepping back from it, putting it on the ironing board and kind of really inspecting the garment before it's finished is great, because you can see that if you've got one seam that's kind of gone off and it's a little bit askew, you might want to go back and fix that. You might want to take that apart, redo it, or you might notice that your overlocking seams have not gone quite as well, so you might want to redo those. You might notice that the thread itself is loose in places, so you might want to change the tension and do that seam again. These things, taking yourself away from the sewing machine and really looking at the garment from afar, will help you see where you're going wrong and where you can fix it. Number 6 on the list is thread matters. So of course you're going to be using thread to sew your pieces together, and you need thread to be able to do any of that. But I bet you didn't think that matching your thread to your fabric was as important as it is. It is. It really is. This is another thing that I really messed up on in my first year of university. I didn't use matching colour thread. I thought just using a yellow thread on yellow fabric was fine. It's not. You need to be able to try and match your fabric to the nearest colour thread possible. If you're new and you're buying a pattern and the fabric from a shop, they will help you. They can help you do that. Or if you're doing it online, they can also you can click an option in most places for the matching thread for that project, which is great because then at least it's done for you. But if not, try and match your thread as close as you can to your fabric. So within my first year, I didn't do this, and I ended up having really untidy sewing because I wasn't used to sewing so much. So I just was like, this will do. No, it didn't. But my sewing was untidy, and it didn't help that my thread was the wrong colour. So my untidy sewing was made more untidy by the fact that my thread was a completely wrong colour to my fabric. Whereas if my thread was matching, it wouldn't have looked as bad. Still bad, but not as bad. So as a beginner, you want to be able to kind of disguise your work, especially if you're still getting used to a sewing machine, the speed and the seam allowance and things like that. You're not going to be perfect straight away. And so if you can disguise the fact that your sewing is just a little wobbly or a little bit off in places, you can do this by making sure that your thread matches your fabric. This is also vital if you are making garments, because even if you don't think you notice the thread, as soon as it's a different colour to the fabric, you would notice. It stands out, quite obvious, and it's something that can either look nice because it's meant to be decorative, or it's something can look really odd because you think, well, why is that a different colour to that? Why is it not matching? And it can be something quite jarring in your mind. So to give you the best kind of possible outcome, make sure your thread matches your fabric, and then any mistakes that you do feel like you have made are a little bit more disguised, and you can feel a bit more comfortable wearing that garment out and nobody noticing that little odd bit of thread that's showing somewhere. This is probably the most obvious on things like hemlines. If you're hemming a dress or in a pair of trousers, you want to make sure your thread matches. Top stitching, if you want your top stitching to be kind of discreet, that's the perfect way, is to make sure that your thread matches. Like for instance, I've got a bit of top stitching on the side of my bodice here, and that is black, so then it matches exactly in with my fabric. Things like when the seam pulls a little, you want to make sure that it's not kind of like showing bright pink or something on a white garment. It's simple things that I think you don't realise until somebody tells you or shows you. And it was something I was really embarrassed about, so it was something that I was really adamant to get on top of for my next project in my second year at university. So it's just my little bit of wisdom to you before you kind of get going in your sewing projects and have wrong colour threads. Number 7 is pay attention to seam allowance. So seam allowance is very important because that is the extra bit of fabric that you are allowed to work with when you are sewing something together. This can change depending on your pattern, where your brand is from, in terms of in the world, or what you're making exactly. I know for a fact that when I made costumes, I was using 1-inch seam allowance ready for fittings to be able to be taken in or out. though fashion is very much different to that and uses a smaller seam allowance. The most important part is that you find out what your seam allowance is before you get started, before you do any cutting whatsoever, and before you do any sewing. Because if your seam allowance is not added already to the pattern, you'd need to do that. So when you lay the pattern pieces out on the fabric, if there's no seam allowance added to that pattern, you would then need to add it onto the pieces around while they're on the fabric. If the pieces already have the seam allowance added, then you don't need to add it onto the fabric, but you also need to make sure that you're aware of the thickness of the seam allowance for when you are sewing. You can mark this on with a pencil if you like, or you can make sure that your sewing machine has a little gauge on the base plate, and you can put like a little bit of tape, or you can put your magnetic gauge on, so then you make sure that it's the tape or the gauge and the fabric runs just at the side of it, so then you can keep a nice even seam allowance all the way through. So this part is really important because this can be like a make or break to the actual garment fitting or the thing working out that you're making. I've often added seam allowance where I didn't need it, so it came up a lot larger than I needed it to be. I've also not added seam allowance when I needed to, so then it came up a lot smaller. So if you're using a garment pattern, for example, make sure you read whether the seam allowance is added or not, and make sure you take note of the seam allowance that they require to use. So even if you think the seam allowance is going to be large in places, make sure you stick to the allotted seam allowance, and then you can do a fitting halfway through when the garment's together structurally, just not finished. That way you can pin it up, like if the shoulders are too long, you can pin it up. You can pin the sides, and you can alter it to fit your body more. It might be that you just need to taper in a little on one side, and things like that. So you can kind of alter that as you go, but make sure you stick to the original seam allowance to start off with. And finally, number 8, patience is power. So something I don't have much of the time is patience. I get very carried away and I just jump ahead, and I don't really kind of take the time to stop, read and follow the instructions properly. I think I know better, though I don't know better, but I sometimes think that I don't need to know that step or to really follow the instructions. I do what I want, and a lot of the time I find that something's missing, something's wrong, or it doesn't fit the way I thought, or just something I've done and it's a little bit hodgepodge and it just doesn't look as nice. I found that it's because I often just kind of run away with myself and I don't take the time to read the pattern. So things like that, make sure that you take the time to give yourself the patience to kind of get all the information you need, give yourself patience to put the actual garment together, and give yourself patience to finish it. Whether it takes you a day, a week or a year, just give yourself the time, the patience, just come back to the project and just kind of relax. Trying to relax, enjoy the sewing process as it is. You need to remember that you aren't in a competition with anyone. The only person that's in this with you is you. So the more time you give yourself to do these things right, the better chance you are going to be of it being successful and having more confidence and wanting to do more. Thank you for joining me on this video. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope it's give you plenty of things to think about and give you some good tips getting started. Make sure you like this video and check out the rest of my beginner sewing series that I will leave a link to here. Bye!